Britain's vote to leave the European Union has been followed by a rise in far-right activism across Europe. In the UK, there have been reports of public racist abuse, while far-right leaning parties across the continent have called for their own referendums. Racist sentiment has always been a part of the European conversation, but the strengthening of these groups has highlighted how much these ideas have started to take root in the political mainstream. They've also made significant gains in the polls, with the serious possibility that nationalist parties such as the Front National in France and the Dutch Party for Freedom may win support in the general elections in their countries. In both countries there has been much coverage of these parties, and their messages appear to have received a positive response from a significant proportion of the public. With elections coming up in France, Germany and possibly Italy later this year, these could determine the future of Europe. Geert Wilders, the leader of the Dutch Party for Freedom, has been campaigning hard in the Dutch elections. Wilders has called for a Dutch referendum on leaving the EU, closing the country's borders and de-Islamising the West. Marine Le Pen in France has formally launched her presidential campaign, promising to put France first by freeing it from the tyrannies of globalization, Islamic fundamentalism and the European Union. Le Pen said Islamic fundamentalism was a yoke France could no longer live under. Why is nationalism rising throughout Europe? And with Britain planning to depart from the European Union, what is the future for the EU as a whole? Simple questions with important answers. And let's start with this. Donald Trump has been elected president in the United States. Does the public see a figure like him getting elected somewhere in Europe? We asked them.
I think so, yeah. It seems like people are kind of discontented with what's going on, so if it can happen there, I suppose it could happen anywhere, yeah.
I don't believe yet that Marine Le Pen can be elected president in France. However, I think elected or not, people like Trump can be elected in Europe. Yes, without any doubt, due to political, ideological and moral decomposition of society.
I think they actually can. If it's in fascist countries that are racist and support the same morals he does, then yeah, he can. There's a possibility he can get elected.
The politicians consider that they are never responsible, so they always claim that the weakest are responsible, those at the bottom of society. Today that means the migrants, the refugees, all those who arrive and who are often fleeing away from countries at war where massacres take place. Western responsibility and intervention are well known here, but these people have no other choice than to go into exile.
I think that it's absolutely possible that elections in Europe will give someone like Trump presidency. In France, it can be Marine Le Pen. Look at what happened in Hungary, in Eastern European countries. If we say it's not possible, we are lying to ourselves, thinking that we have some sort of natural protection in Europe against these kind of things. Not at all. Today, populist currents are very strong.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think there's with this there's a whole climate change going on in terms of what people sort of see happening in this world. So yeah, I can see that.
There is a very strong economic crisis, and different political groups are giving different answers. We must not compare everything. But in between the two world wars, in 1929 and 1930, there's been a very similar, very important economic crisis. And that was a starting point for Nazism in Germany, which only ended after the Second World War.
I think definitely you would have to say that it's a possibility, given the recent, political changes in Europe, with Marine Le Pen in France leading in some polls, and then you have recently the Austrian far-right Freedom Party losing by just over 2% in their elections, and then you have other cases like Germany, Hungary, and so on. But I'd like to point out that I don't believe Donald Trump is necessarily a nationalist. I think he's surrounded himself by people like Steve Bannon, who are nationalists. But his political ideology is a lot less clear. than some of these other right-wing parties in Europe. So I would make a distinction between the two.
In Europe, there already has been leaders like him. In Britain, Winston Churchill, and it's very fitting that Donald Trump has put the bust of Churchill back in the Oval Office after Obama moved it, and it will serve as an inspiration for any genocidal campaigns the United States goes on next. I think here in Britain, there is this idea that it is a lapdog, that it only follows US policy, but Britain works in British interest, and they already have their leaders here who have as much blood on their hands as the United States.
Why, in the public's view, are anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim politicians becoming popular in places like France, Holland, Germany and the US?
Sensationalism. They don't seem to be providing any facts for the kind of the prejudice that they have against these people, and as a result, people are seeing these and they're attaching, I suppose, their disillusionment to what is most attractive, and that's what those leaders are making most attractive at the moment, I think.
Obviously, I don't mean it in a bad way, but Muslims are, or people that claim Islam are kind of, they bomb places and stuff like that, so it's a bad look. So people obviously see them in a bad image, basically.
We have noticed a lepanization of the spirits in the beginning, and nowadays racism is banalized. Racist comments have become very ordinary. I am convinced that in this rise of racism, there is a reason behind it. For me, it's the colonial policy, because look at what has happened to Theo Aulnay-sous-Bois, who was raped by the police with a baton. When they use the derogative terms that are reminiscent of colonialism in Africa, it reminds me of the way that colonialists behaved in Africa and other colonized countries towards the indigenous people. Today, the indigenous people in France are the refugees, the migrants, the children of the migrants, all those who are black, Arab, Muslim. They emphasize and centralize the fear that is created to divert us away from the economic crisis.
There is a shift towards populism. People are becoming disgusted by elections. Yes, Trump was elected, but about 50% of the people are not voting. Thinking that we can be spared of that kind of phenomenon is not realistic.
I think it's just the life now, the things that are happening. People are so dissatisfied. There's such a wider gap. Instead of us coming together, we're all being drawn further and further apart.
I think it's really, there's two things. I think it's one, well, it's mostly about immigration, I think. But I would say there is a second thing, and it's about globalisation as well. How people are fed up with they don't seem to have much money, don't have many jobs. So there's a big change. So someone like Trump, you might or may not agree with some of his views, but he resonates with a lot of people in America, and you can see that coming across to Europe as well.
In the 30s, the targets were the Jews and the Gypsies, but especially the communists and the trade unionists. Today, the target is no longer Jews, even if you still see signs of anti-Semitism. And the National Front has maintained its old concepts. But today, the target is more the migrants, Islam and Arabs. There's a great deal of Islamophobia today in France and in Europe.
I mean, the easy answer would be terrorism, right? That's the usual answer that's given for increasing anti-immigrant sentiments. However, I think it's deeper than that. It's the politics of the other, having to blame someone for your own, economic problems and so on. And it's always easy to have a scapegoat, to say it's not because you're not doing well, it's because these people are causing your, problems. So with nationalist movements, you always need a scapegoat. So in Nazi Germany, it was the Jews, and then you had, other examples of that around the world. And now it happens to be Muslims, and they seem to be an easy target. And you also have this mix of the fake news sources as well that have been spreading, and also the media. So the media sensationalizes terrorism to the point where it's a lot bigger than it needs to be. And obviously it also, film, media, you have Muslims portrayed as terrorists and as demons, and it dehumanizes Muslims to the point where people see them not as human beings, but as almost caricatures of who they really are. And this leads to sometimes irrational fear of Muslims and Islam in general.
it's not just in those countries. Here in Britain, a nation that's had more fascist parties than any other nation on the planet, anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant rhetoric is very popular. It is an easy sell. That is why you have the rise of parties like UKIP. Other parties like the National Front and BNP, they're gone, they're finished. They don't have the polished image that UKIP has or anything like them. And even so-called left-wing parties here play into the anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant label. You had Nexit here, you have the Labour Party here, which is a big colonial institution which works hand in hand on racist issues. It was Churchill who had the motto, "Keep England White," and in 2003 when Blair destroyed Iraq, it wasn't Iraq why the British public was angry with him, it was because of his immigration policies.
Throughout Europe, we have seen a rise in nationalism. Why? The public said this.
I really don't know. It's a surprising thing. Again, you look at the American election and I suppose it's just a lot of people feel left out or left behind, and so when somebody comes along and says, I can fix this for you, that's obviously a very appealing option, and if nationalism is included in those opinions, then that's obviously going to lead to a rise in nationalism overall.
The turning point in the 90s, the failure of socialism, has created a situation where the conservative right wing obtained ideological hegemony. Since the 60s and the 70s, there's an evolution in society. When before political currents emphasised on us in the first place, with the ideological victory of the liberals, it's become a focus on me, myself and I. This me means everyone for themselves.
Yeah, they're getting more scared, especially what's going on with the world today. It's making an impact on everyone else, so people are more likely to get scared of what's going on and stuff. And
we have seen in the past other moments of profound crisis of capitalism, like between the two world wars. We have witnessed as well that these kind of situations can lead to catastrophes linked to the rise of nationalist and racist political currents. And countries like France and England have a colonial past that has not disappeared so far.
For me, the economic crisis is of a minor importance. Of course, there is unemployment, but the economic crisis is not the main explanation here. Most important here is the crisis of values. People do not know anymore the place they have in society. Because of this crisis of values, the essence of solidarity, of equality, of liberty, of fraternity have been rendered meaningless. I am convinced that the crisis of these values leads to fears, to a malaise, and today this fears leads to a rejection of the other.
Again, I think it's immigration, I'm afraid, and people losing their jobs. They see themselves in some areas becoming minorities in the places they live, and it brings on this extremism, unfortunately.
I think that at the presidential elections, the abstention rate will almost be 50%, and the abstention rate will be essentially in popular areas. It's not amongst the rich or people with money. They are going to vote, but ordinary people are not voting. So the election outcome must be relativised because of the high abstention rate and because of all these people of popular areas who are not even registered. To face the difficulties, actually it's Marine Le Pen who appears as the anti-system candidate. Meanwhile, during a long time it was a communist candidate who showed us the other way to society.
The problem with nationalism is few people saw it coming. But if you look at the signals and the signs, it's been on the rise for a long time. And it's a combination of reasons. You have to look at income inequality as one of the reasons. An Oxfam report recently found out that the richest few own 50% of the world's wealth. And then you have to look at issues of failures in global governance. So, the UN and multinational institutions and so on, and their failures to provide equitable growth in the world. And then you also have to look at the fact that some center-left parties have ignored essentially working class people and haven't really been a champion for their aims and goals. And then you also have to talk about the industrialization of most of these industrialized economies, like the UK with steel and the US with coal mines. And a lot of these jobs have gone away and they're not coming back. So unemployment in the working class is higher. And so they need somewhere to turn. And unfortunately, because center-left parties have ignored the working class, they're having to turn to far-right parties to fill that void. And that has created this rise in nationalism.
Nationalism is an easy sell, but nationalism in an imperialist country is a dangerous thing because it puts different imperialist nations in the EU, France, Britain mainly, competing with each other. They don't give each other a bit of space that they used to. They will now actually be competing with Brexit when it comes to the looting of Africa and also getting control of the Gulf monarchies.
The Dutch Freedom Party could win 28 seats in the 150-member chamber, more than the 27 projected for Prime Minister Mark Rutte's Liberal Party, according to a poll. Meanwhile, in Germany, frustration about lost border controls and economic problems have helped the Alternative for Germany, known by its German initials AfD, to become the nation's fastest growing party, showing support at 12%, ahead of some mainstream parties and in third place in some national polls. We invited the public in Britain and in France to consider why discussion around immigration has become so toxic and polarising.
It's just because the opinions of the people who are against immigration are obviously a lot easier to digest, and the opinions that are for immigration are not. And again, as we were talking about, a lot of people are feeling left behind, and so they're kind of almost attracted to these sound bites because they think, oh yeah, that must be it. And the people that are fighting for immigration probably aren't doing it as in as congestible and as easy to understand. So that would explain why it's become so toxic.
Donc il y a des peurs.
So they are fears, and the government in the first place is responsible for these fears. They maintain and exploit these fears. That's extremely dangerous, because when someone is scared, he is scared. You must give him the strength and the elements to understand and to think differently. Now exactly the opposite is being done. We're in a situation of adventure, a very dangerous adventure, that can allow indeed the election of someone like Trump, and maybe even worse than Trump. The risk exists. We have to face it clearly.
I'm not sure, because I don't know, the stuff you hear about immigrants coming in and stuff, so obviously make them angry, things about stealing jobs and stuff.
We notice that there's a resistance amongst the population. For instance, in the United States, the demonstrations against Trump are numerous and very important. Demonstrations come from different horizons, feminists, black people. In France, the protests must not be neglected either. I'm very positively impressed, for instance, by the villages in France who decided to welcome asylum seekers. The National Front has demonstrated against them, and every time more important demonstrations have been held of people opposed to the banning of the asylum seekers.
I think because people get labelled as being racist, which I think is wrong. I think if people have genuine concerns, we live in a democratic Europe, so people should be able to express those views.
We're in a situation where everything becomes possible. Nobody really knows where we go. Many people are very disappointed in the European Union because it's the union of finance. Brexit shows it very well. The situation in Greece as well. The referendum in 2005 gave a majority of voters in favour of no to an EU treaty. But finally the yes passed. That shows clearly that a European Union is useless except for bankers.
I think it hasn't become polarizing. It's always been polarizing. It's always been contentious. The difference is when right-wing views are allowed into the mainstream political discourse, as we've seen recently, is where the issue comes. And this isn't the first time. We've seen it with Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and the Conservative Party, where they brought in right-wing views into the mainstream. And this meant that people started to discuss right-wing views more, because if the Prime Minister is talking about it, then it becomes a mainstream talking point. And then you have Jean-Marie Le Pen in France, who also brought right-wing views into the mainstream, and François Mitterrand tried to use this to weaken the far-right party in France, but it backfired, and all it did was it legitimized some of these mainstream views. And you also have to talk about the failure of social liberalism and neoliberalism in the 21st century, and how this has led to a lot of people feeling that the views and opinions of a small elite have been put over theirs. That cannot be ignored as well.
For a number of reasons, the state itself plays into this rhetoric because it allows them to cover up what they're really doing, and it takes the discussions away. It's very easy to blame an immigrant or someone of a Muslim background now. In the past it was Irish and it was people from the Caribbean here. But you must remember, that's always been the case here. It's not something that's come out of thin air. There's always been this toxic and polarizing rhetoric surrounding immigration and Muslims and anybody else who they can target, because if the eye is not on the imperialist, they can blame the small people below them and put people against each other.
With Britain set to leave the European Union, what are the public's predictions about the future of the EU?
If I'm completely honest, I don't believe, it's not going to be the end of the world. I think religion is a bigger problem with regards to starting wars and starting disagreements amongst people. Understanding has to be there. We have to foster understanding whether or not we're in a single market. And if we understand where each country is coming from, then it's going to be a lot easier for us to work together. And that goes across the board, between the European Union and Europe's relationship with places like the United States and Russia.
You've got people that have come here, and obviously if you're leaving the European Union, you can't go certain places. Now you have to get a visa. Do you know what I'm saying? It's ridiculous. So I think the EU, Britain's just going to fall apart. I really do think it's going to fall apart, and it's a bad choice. I really think Brexit should be banned.
I think it's very, very rocky time for Europe, especially with the elections coming up in France and Belgium. If one of those leaves the EU, or Le Pen got in, then I think it could be very fractious for Europe.
My personal opinion is that the European Union must absolutely change and be transformed. That's the only way it can survive. It remains only an economic space, a space of exchange of goods. It will explode. The European Union must become a real social and cultural common space. The European space must become a real space of solidarity, and not just an intra-European space of solidarity, but also a space of solidarity with the South. That's the only way for Europe to save itself.
We notice that every time when there's an election, or for instance Brexit, or in 2005, when we had the referendum which rejected the European Constitution, a majority of voters rejected the Constitution at almost 55%. These voters were treated as silly, they haven't understood anything, they lack education, and a rational vote would be in favour of Europe. But people in their daily lives notice that the European Union has not resolved their problems, but made them worse. Austerity measures, blocking salaries, relocating factories are justified by using the argument of Europe and the globalisation. So in popular areas, Europe and the globalisation are rejected.
So it's difficult to say what the future of the European Union will be. However, if you look at the trend with major countries within the European Union, so Italy, France, Germany, it depends on their leadership. So if someone like Le Pen comes to power in France, that is definitely a minus for the unity of the European Union. However, the concerns about the European Union are quite valid because people don't feel that they're being represented. People in Greece feel very strongly about the European Union, people in Spain, in Portugal, and so on. And they feel that the European Union doesn't represent them and has become a typical, global entity that is beholden to multinational corporate interest. So this would need to be changed and reformed if the European Union is to rebuild trust with its citizens.
Without Britain, it is finished. There is no more EU without Britain. It's a huge economic powerhouse. France is set to leave too, if you look at their polls over there. So I think without those two nations, the main imperial forces in Europe, there is no more EU, which is going to put European nations competing against each other when it comes to getting trade abroad. As you already see here in Britain, they've already called their trade model Empire Part 2. So when it comes to other European nations, they're not going to be sitting idly by and allowing Britain to just go and do this. They'll be competing with each other, and it may even lead to more proxy wars and skirmishes.
While the far right has tried to move itself into the mainstream, its violent edge has remained. As the European debate on immigration and Muslims has become more pronounced, the tensions have become ever more public and in some cases more violent. Will the far-right parties in France and Holland surge to victory the same way that Trump spectacularly won the US presidential elections? And if they do, what are the implications for the rest of Europe and the European Union? The public will make their choice. And if there is a lurch to extremism, the whole of Europe will live with the consequences.